Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is the Byte Show. And tonight, we're going to talk with Walter Bosley about his book, Empire of the Wheel. Yes, you heard me right. Empire of the Wheel. And the book is about espionage, the occult, and murder in Southern California. Very interesting book, Walter.
Thank you.
What prompted you to write this book?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, GeorgeAnn. I appreciate that. This book came out of research on my book just prior to Empire of the Wheel called Latitude 33 Key to the Kingdom, wherein I had done some research on Disneyland and ley lines and some interesting experiences that I had had there years before. In following up on that book, the Latitude 33 book, really focuses on an intersection of three ley lines in the park.
Oh.
Yeah, after finishing that book, I wondered, okay, if I followed these ley lines, where would they lead? And two of them led right out here in the area where I live, the Inland Empire. And I thought, well, let's look around and see, if there's any strange tales of the paranormal or whatever associated with the areas where these lines run through. And sure enough, I found a ghost story. And I had been digging into some various interesting related things in the entire area. The Inland Empire is mostly, as I know it, all my life, San Bernadino and Riverside were two cities that kind of came up at about the same time. And I was making some interesting discoveries in Riverside and San Bernardino, and I came upon this ghost story of a woman named Corus Stanton.
Yes.
Yeah, whose ghost was allegedly haunting a shopping mall out here, and I thought, well, that's interesting. So as I started looking into that, I discovered, with the help of a local librarian out here, a lady named Ann Walker, that there was a whole interesting tale behind this ghost story. And one thing led to another, and I just started uncovering a bunch of interesting information, historical and esoteric. And I convinced my co-author, Richard Spence, that there was something to it. And, it was really one of those things where one book led to another.
Oh. Well, there seems to be suicides that are not really suicides. What about Corus Stanton? She was found in a lake, and oddly enough, with her belongings on the other side of the lake.
Well, they were, they might as well have been on the other side of the lake, as far away as they were. She was a stranger in town, complete stranger. And yes, she was found dead in the lake on the morning of, early in the day of November 19th, 1915. And there was no suicide note found. There was no purse. In fact, the newspapers, as the book relates, very specifically stated that there was no purse, no lady's hat, nor any suicide note found.
Yeah.
And this was reported for several days until finally, lo and behold, there was just that, a lady's hat, a purse, and a suicide note found. And of course, as you mentioned, these were found, more than 300 feet away from where her body was found, on the other side of the fence line of the park and under a bush.
Oh.
The whole thing, and of course the book goes into all the interesting little details that make that factor very questionable. My co-author and I personally don't think it was a suicide at all. And he and I, we present the facts and the evidence to support the idea that there's something funny going on here.
Yeah, there certainly is. I mean, even the labels of her clothing were disfigured or destroyed.
Right, they were either scratched out or removed. And I want to add too that the book goes into, there was also poison found in her stomach during the autopsy that followed, and there was and they had known that from the first day. But, several days later, when the lady's hat, purse, and suicide note were found, conveniently there was also a bottle of poison found with her things. So it just lends to the idea of a plant. And then when you add the labels, as you mentioned, on her clothes, either removed or scratched out, it becomes even more interesting.
Well, and there's this thing about green oranges that I found very strange. I don't know of anyone I've ever heard of that's ever died from eating a green orange. Well,
and neither have I, and I don't think any of us have ever heard of that, because quite frankly, as the book presents, we think that the girl, indeed, the orange was poisoned. As the book points out, remember, there was a toxin found in her body that they were never able to identify. Now, some people would think 1915, maybe medical science wasn't so good, but you have to remember, poisonings were one of the top 3 methods of murder back then in the early 20th century, and accidental poisonings happened a lot, surprisingly maybe to our modern mind. Medical science was very good at identifying toxins, and they should have, if this had been a run-of-the-mill kind of poisoning or even accidental poisoning, they would have been able to identify it as such.
Yes.
The fact that they could never identify the poison that killed the teenage girl who ate the green orange, or the 2 little children, the little F-step children, 2 and 4 years old, they could never identify that poison either. And that, again, pushes us down a road that's very interesting.
Well, there was a little girl, Orta Hedges,
that's the teenage girl who ate the green orange, yes.
14 years old.
Mm-hmm.
My goodness.
Yeah, and it looks, it looked initially to me when I was reading the news reports, my first thought I came away was that this looks like they had possibly a serial killer on their hands. From my first day reviewing all these news reports, and what's an interesting aspect of that is that as much as this was all over the papers in the area back then in 1915, it seems to have disappeared after that. I've never found a reference to this mystery again in print or anywhere until Rick and I put out Empire of the Wheel. So for about 96 years, it went unmentioned, untalked about, not even reflected upon.
Well,
it was quickly buried.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe there was some kind of religion behind this?
No. You mean behind the murders or the burying it?
The both, actually.
I don't think that any organized religion or church was involved with burying it at all. I do firmly believe that there were members or agents, so to speak, in the spiritualist community that were definitely involved. And that's based on all the facts of the case. And again, as I said, Rick and I present all of that in the book, but there's every reason to believe that spiritualists were involved with it, and probably local members of the local temple, which was the first spiritualist temple in California, by the way, here in San Bernadino, founded in the late 1800s. And it was there in 1915.
Who was it run by?
There was a family, the Brown family, that their patriarch, who was one of the pioneer founders of San Bernadino, who was also one of the founders of the Spiritualist Temple. Back then it was called the Brotherhood of Kindred Spirits, I believe.
Yes.
And they were an interesting group of people. Brown himself had written a book in which he talked about his psychic and strange esoteric experiences from the time he was 8 years old. And he had visitations. He had an entity named Apolloquist who came to him along with several other entities and had communicated with him, he claimed, from the time he was a child. And, of course, he's an adult, into his middle adult years by the time he comes to San Bernardino. So he's had many experiences with them in his own account that got darker and not so good, not so positive as he got older.
Yeah.
Particularly if he refused to take their instruction or if they told him to do something that he disagreed with morally or ethically, they would turn very belligerent, very dark on him, and would tell him things that they would do to him and others if he did not carry out their orders. It's a very interesting story. It's called Medium of the Rockies. And I've seen an original copy of the book in the Special Collections room. A very, very interesting guy. And in 1915, his sons were prominent figures in town. But what I discovered was it's almost impossible to find a roster, a list of membership of the actual temple back then. That seems to be kept very successfly away from the public record. However, when you go back to the founding members of the temple, find several of the prominent founding pioneer families that had representatives who were the founding members of the temple. So it was, and you got to remember, spiritualism back then. And when I say spiritualists were involved in this, I don't mean that every spiritualist is, an evil villain.
Yeah.
I'm of course saying that certain members who were inclined to commit darker acts, to the extent they were guided by their philosophy, whatever their personal philosophy was. These are individuals who took it upon themselves, to do something, and they're not necessarily representative of the entire movement. But you have to remember, as far as who was in the temple at the time, this was a very popular movement back in the early 20th century, and a lot of people were spiritualists or involved with spiritualism in much the same way that many men were members of Masonic lodges. Membership does not necessarily mean that you're guilty of any wrongdoing or involved in any nefarious deeds. But it just so happens that the evidence strongly points to spiritualists.
Well, weren't there a number of men who were Mormon that were also spiritualists?
There were a few, actually. The Mormons in San Bernardino that founded the city, John Brown was a guide with them who was part of their expedition, so to speak, from the east of here, from the Plain States, when they first came to the San Bernardino Valley. And it wasn't very long after that the Brown and the other members of the temple founded the temple that actually the Mormons ceased having anything to do with them, the San Bernardino Mormons, because the stories they were hearing, some of the run-ins they had with Brown, they decided that, it was just time to part ways. And, of course, there was the Mormon recall well before 1915 that, pretty much took away the strong Mormon presence in the administration of the city. They pretty much just pulled up stakes and left San Bernardino to the non-Mormon folks, Brown and the other prominent families, among them. So in this particular, by this case, by 1915, the Mormon presence really, wasn't an issue, and the few Mormons that were into official spiritualism, when I say that, I mean with a capital S, the movement of the time, they either gave it up and left with the Mormons during the recall, or they left the Mormon Church. Now, that said, we have to remember that, Joseph Smith, many of the methods he used to get his esoteric information are, just right out of the esoteric and what you would call spiritualist handbook almost.
Yes.
Stones and such like that. But, a lot of people use these things. Not all of them are involved in nefarious acts such as, murder and things like that.
Well, it certainly might draw some kind of malevolent force around you.
What would specifically the...
Yeah, to engage in spiritism.
You're right. There's always that danger. That's, why most people, a lot of people, probably, that's why a lot of them don't fool with it. That's why some people who fool with things shouldn't fool with it, because they don't know what they're doing, and they quite often don't know what they're talking about, because they like to factor out. There's the folks that, it's the folks that say, I believe in angels, but I don't believe devils exist. Well, okay.
Yeah.
When I'm done laughing, I usually try to avoid the rest of that conversation.
Yeah. Opening the door that you cannot close, can be very dangerous.
But remember, in this book, what we try to point out is the esoteric, the occult, the actual spirit realm part of this. In our book, we recognize that these are the things that motivate certain people philosophically, but what was done, in our opinion, the aspect we present, was somebody murdered these people, and there were 7 total that we think murdered. And whatever was motivating them, the crimes were very real, and the method of the crime, especially as far as the poison was concerned, has a spiritualist imprint on it, and we present all that in the book. How the knowledge of poisons was something that was quite associated with spiritualism at that time.
Wow!
Certain enthusiasts of spiritualism were very knowledgeable in poison. There's the whole issue of the Harry Houdini case, which I personally am convinced was indeed murder.
Yes.
Spiritualists, I do believe, murdered him, and poison was part of it. There's a Houdini connection to the mystery here in San Bernadino of 1915. There's a major player in the Houdini story that was here in San Bernadino and was a player in the Empire of the Wheel mystery. And, you have that, you have the spiritualist presence, you have all these factors, and it just kind of, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Oh, yes. And there is plenty of smoke, boy. This little girl, the 14-year-old girl, didn't they say that she had eaten green oranges?
Yeah, well, she had been eating, they'd found where she had eaten part of a green orange. And she had also eaten, the family dinner that evening. What's interesting is they don't say exactly where she got the poison. They don't say exactly that the orange itself was poisoned. They just say that the only thing she had eaten that the rest of the family had not that day was this green orange she was eating on. The available facts don't even say that, they're just not conclusive. They did the test on, what was in her stomach and such, and they found in her system this unidentifiable poison. and it did not come from the food that the family ate because none of them were afflicted. The food was tested. There was, the poison wasn't in there. So it is pretty much presented that, that the orange was the source of the poison after all, and where she got it is anybody's guess, because anyone who's lived out here, even in our times, more so when I was a kid, 30, 40 years ago, there are still orange groves here. There were a lot of orange groves, even, when I was a kid.
Yes. Yeah.
It's common. You can walk right there out in public. You can walk right up and pull one off the tree and eat an orange. So she could very well have done that, just pick the orange herself, or somebody could have given her that orange. A 14-year-old girl back then, young ladies got married, a lot younger.
Yes.
So she's approaching that age where men might men certainly probably were beginning to, look at her in that way, and I think she crossed paths with a bad man who, gave her that orange, and a bad man with an agenda, which she fit, as the book specifically points out.
Yes. Oh, my. Well, there was a man named Percy Braid.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he was found with a towel around his head to muffle a bullet to his head. Yes,
the gun. He was found in bed in his room in the house he was living. He was a boarder, and he didn't come to breakfast. So I think his sister was there, and the landlord or his sister went to get him to call him for breakfast, and they found him dead of a gunshot wound in his bed. Of course, there had been a towel wrapped around his head to muffle the gunshot. And, of course, they found the gun in his hand and such. So for all the world, it looked like a suicide.
Yeah.
What's very interesting is that gun, they don't know how he came into the possession of it, but it was, as a matter of record, the weapon used in another local suicide, and it was in the office of a lawyer. That was, Mr. Braid was like an estate manager or an accountant.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And this lawyer he was well known because he was a law student. He was well known to, the lawyers around town, and this lawyer was a client of his, and somehow he had come into possession of this weapon used in another suicide just about 6 months or less than a year prior to his own. So, if he were indeed suicidal, and Braid is the only one of the 7 who I think there is a chance that it could have been suicide, but even if it was suicide, and we state this in the book and why, he knew something. He was aware of what was going on. He was involved in some of these intrigues, and an accumulation of all that is what would have driven him to suicide. But I think that there's just as much reason to think that it was set up to look like a suicide.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Tell us of some others in the book that you suspect.
Well, it starts really with a man identified as O.H. Bailey. Bailey, he's kind of an itinerant worker. He's living in a local boarding house. He's known to people around town, especially in the boarding house. And within 24 hours of Corus Stanton being found dead, O.H. Bailey's body, or let's put it this way as the book presents, a body is found in the foothill of the San Bernadino Mountains, according to the first newspaper story. And this body has been so mummified by the elements being outside in the sun that the individual is unrecognizable. and the way they describe it is ghastly and all that. But he's wearing a suit with a Masonic lapel pin, and he's holding a gun in one hand, and there is a ring, a signet ring with a little symbol on it, on a hand. And inside, of course, is a wallet or billfold of such identifying this body as O.H. Bailey. Now, as it turns out, O.H. Bailey has not been seen for about 90 days. He was, here the body turns up, being found within 24 hours of this mystery woman being found drowned to death. And she's quickly ruled a suicide. Bailey, of course, found on his knees with the bullet wound to the, of course, now mummified skull, for all the world looking like a suicide. And here's what's interesting. In the boarding house, remember, the man has been gone for 90 days, but no one thinks to knock on his door or check the room or even go in and clean the room or whatever until his body is found. And then they go into his room and they find Masonic regalia laid out neatly on the bed, plus his suicide note. Now, what's interesting is you got to wonder how long had that stuff been sitting there on the bed, and how far ahead did he pay the rent, the board on the room, the rent and board, that it took them the discovery of his body before they thought to go into his room. I mean, if you're going to kill yourself, are you really going to pay, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months ahead on the rent of your room?
No.
That's very questionable. See, there's something fishy about that. So was that O.H. Bailey's body? Or was O.H. Bailey a guy who, needed to skip town? Now, we get into all the implications of that and all those details in the book. And, but that's, O.H. Bailey is what we call, chronologically, he would have died, if that was his body, in mid-August. And so he's victim number one. And victim number two is a man named Isidore Jasseau, who's a well-known hunter and trapper and just kind of general guide up in the San Bernadino Mountains. And he dies in an accidental, in a boating accident up on what was, it's still called Baldwin Lake, but it's dry. There's no water in it. Even then it was a seasonal lake. And this was in October. In fact, October, I think it was a Friday the 13th, interestingly enough. And he dies in this rafting accident. Now, that in itself sounds like nothing. However, as I'll get into later, you got to understand that we identified a ley line or telluric current running right through that lake. And I'll get into that later, but that's why he popped up on our radar, drowning. Now, the other reason that we put him on the list is the fact that he did drown. See, here's the recurring themes: O.H. Bailey, an alleged suicide; Isidore Jasseau, an accidental drowning. And then by the time you get to Corus Stanton, you've got a suicidal drowning victim. Okay, so there's a theme running there. That's very interesting. Well, so you have Bailey number one, Jasseau number two, and then the two children I mentioned earlier, 2 and 4 years old, Willie and Eileen Estep. They have ingested poisoned candy. The parents are cleared by the investigators. The type of poison cannot be identified. And subsequently, they sent it off to the lab. It was never identified. They never found any sign of any more of this candy or any of this type of poison anywhere near the home.
Well, do they know what the poison was?
They were never able to identify it.
How is that possible?
Well, the book gets into that, too. We think that there were toxins that, known to experts in poisoning, that would have had access to such a toxin that would be unidentifiable to local authorities. In other words, from other parts of the world. And that's where the East Indian connection comes in.
Yes.
Which further leads to further tie the perpetrators to spiritualism.
Yeah.
So you have the two children, those are victims 3 and 4, so that by the time the little girl, the little boy, I think, either the little boy or the little girl dies within, just like a day, 24 hours of Corus Stanton, and they find O.H. Bailey's body. So you have Bailey, Jasot, the Estep children are really victims 1 through 4, and then Corus Stanton is victim 5. And then, of course, you have the 14-year-old girl in Redlands, Orta Hedges, who dies of poisoning.
Yes.
Not a suicide, and, of course, the children are naturally assumed not to be suicides. And then, finally, you have Mr. E.P. Braid, the man we talked about, found with the gunshot wound, which is interesting that, there he is in the house he lives, his sister's there, his other people living in the house, and nobody heard the gunshot. I would argue that, depending upon the caliber of the weapon, yes, and the type of weapon, they should have heard something, but perhaps not. Interestingly enough, the newspapers don't go into certain details that we would these days, but that's what we have to work with. So there you have those 7 victims. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of which all die within just a few weeks of each other. One of which whose body is unidentifiable as him, however, other circumstances are left behind to convince folks that it is him. And then there's the man who, if Braid actually was a suicide, then it is possible Jasot was an accident until you look at, as I mentioned, the ley line data. You see all these 7 victims that I've just laid out for you.
Yes.
They all died on or in a very close physical proximity to ley lines, telluric energy currents.
Oh, my goodness. Oh. Well, that is very, what would be the right word? It's more than just interesting. It's pretty compelling. Yes,
compelling, absolutely. I have to tell you, I had worked on this between the investigating and the research. I'd been working on it for about a year or so, maybe a year and a half, when I approached Rick Spence, my co-author, because of all the players in this, Mr. Aleister Crowley pops up, and Rick Spence is the author of one of the better Crowley books out there called Secret Agent 666.
Yeah.
And I went to him because I was shocked when I read that book to discover that in the fall of 1915, Aleister Crowley had come to California. And as I present in the book, my research, my investigation proves that he had to have come through San Bernadino around the time of these deaths. The record shows, pretty much proves that he went through here. Now, many people say, aha, that evil guy, Aleister Crowley, had to have been involved in this. And I know some friends that are still convinced that he was. I do not think so. I think, interestingly enough, Crowley was opposed to what happened here. I do think he was or became aware of it. And I'm convinced, I do believe that he would have been opposed to it. But the fact that he was here, and in his journey west from New York, he happened to have made stops, certain key stops along the way, and every one of them corresponded with the ley line network. The book goes into the detail as to why we think Crowley's trip west ties into this Empire of the Wheel mystery. And Rick had written this book, but he'd written it from the angle of Crowley's trip and his intelligence spy contacts and his political reasons for coming west and having to do with his connections and building the network. And I found it a fascinating synchronicitous correspondence to my mystery. So I started corresponding with Rick. He began giving me all sorts of great background material, and pretty soon I said, hey, Rick, why don't you write this thing with me, because you're giving me great stuff. And by that time, he'd become very intrigued with the premise.
Yeah.
And, we agreed that we would, while we would present the esoteric elements in our analysis, that would be kept to a possible motivation of the killer or killers for committing these acts. You see, we pretty much present the theory that these were human sacrifices for an esoteric purpose, driven by occult esoteric purpose.
Well, but usually there's occult human sacrifice when it's done for, a coven or what have you. It's typically, they don't use poison, they want blood.
Well, it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And remember, death works, no matter how that death is effected. Think about it. Bailey, whoever that person was, that body up on the hill, indeed died of that gunshot wound to the head. Now, Jasot drowned. Drowning is not an easy way to die by any stretch of the imagination, unless you're unconscious when it happens.
Yeah.
The children suffered for a few days after being given that poison candy. There was much suffering, not to mention the associated suffering of the parents. They didn't just die suddenly without any drama. I mean, they lingered on, and it was, I would venture to say that was a horrible way for them to die. Then Corus Stanton, not only did she have the poison in her system wrenching through her body, she drowned, and there were a couple of bruised areas on her body that indicate someone holding her down. The book, of course, presents her death in quite vivid terms, as you know.
Yeah.
Based on the medical science research of what happens when a human being drowns and is dying of poisoning. Then, of course, again, with the poisoning, Orta Hedges, I'm sure that was no picnic. And then we have, of course, Percy Braid, who dies of a gunshot wound. So actually, the poisoning is not the easy way to go, and, of course, drowning and gunshot wounds aren't either. You have to look at it this way. If you're doing a traditional sacrifice like the Aztecs or the Mayans used to do, and you're doing it on the top of a pyramid, you're going to be very melodramatic about it. You want that victim screaming, thrashing, and horrified, and you've got an audience watching you, and on and so forth. However, those were different times, and so we're living in modern times, and I would venture to say that the person committed enough to human sacrifice who wants to get away with it stands a better chance of using a less dramatic means to affect a result than, just hacking and slashing, cutting the heart out of somebody and putting on a big show. This would indicate to me the nature of these murders. The person who would go to these lengths because they definitely want to get away with it, this is the person that has more to lose than the average psychopath.
Yeah.
This is the person who might have station in life, might have money and name and stuff like that, or people that are associated with them that have been promised things. So certainly it's not the traditional human sacrifice on the bleeding stone kind of manner, but we believe the key in the killer's mind was that these deaths occur in association to these ley lines. It was something that was being done that they just didn't want to draw that kind of attention to themselves. That's why they made it look like suicides and children eating poison.
Well, having said that death works, I want to ask you a question that's totally unrelated to your book.
Mm-hmm.
There is a problem with a man who orders people to be killed in foreign lands by means of a drone strike. Each strike can pop off 15 or 20 people, including, women and children, and sort of a murder list, if you will, under the guise of their boogeyman, Al-Qaeda. Walter, could this have a cult type of implications, trying to stay in power, this kind of thing?
I would. That's possible, of course. Anything being possible, that's possible. I tell you what, for that to pop up on my radar in that way, it would be interesting to know if the drone strikes were, for me, this is me speaking.
Yeah.
If I were to find that these drone strikes corresponded to the ley line grid, I would find that very interesting. That would make me pause and wonder. I think it's more of a cynical use of these things to stay in power. More of a look at me, I'm doing this for you. I see it more of a cynical political move than an esoteric occultic move. But one never knows.
Yeah, I'm very suspicious of it. Well, you mention in your book.
But let me just say this though. Any of the targets that are legitimate, because whereas anything can be used as a boogeyman, the fact is there are terrorist murders out there, and we are better off when they're erased because they're not going to stop. So we have to remember that we don't have access to every bit of information that they do. He does, so to speak. And, you have to factor, if you're going to recognize the possibility that something corrupt and bad's going on, you must accept the possibility that it could be the righteous thing as well. And I'll leave that at that.
Okay. You mention in your book a German Hindu conspiracy in Mexico that's all...
actually, California.
Yeah, it's all kind of interwoven and connected. How does this work into things?
Oh, my goodness. In a very big way, which, of course, the book spells out in much better detail than I can sum it up here. But what you had at that time was World War I was going on. In the United States, remember, the Lusitania had just been sunk in May of 1915. So, this was all part of the drama to try to, that was included in getting the U.S. to enter the war.
Yes.
At the time, we were trying to stay out of it, trying to remain neutral. However, you had German and British agents all over the place in the U.S. doing various things. Among these things were sabotage of shipping. If the Germans thought they could sabotage British shipping or any shipping supporting the Brits, they'd be doing it. Especially here, and this is what's interesting, you don't hear anything about this now, but back then, during the middle of this drama, 1915, there was a vast network of German and East Indian spies working up and down the west coast of the United States, from Seattle on down to San Diego. And they were sabotaging ships, and here's where the alliance comes from. Remember, at the time, India was very much involved back then. This was before Gandhi, but during the early years of his efforts and such, was part of this whole era that I'm talking about. But in 1915, you had East Indians that very much were opposing the British rule there, in India, in the homeland. So here you have England, the Great Britain at war with Germany. Your enemy's enemy is your friend. So Germany, their thinking was, well, let's keep the Brits busy on two fronts. So the Germans were supplying India with weapons via the United States. And these weapons would be transported by railroad to San Diego and put on a boat and then shipped off to Burma, where the Indian, rebellion would get these weapons, and it would aid them in their rebellion against the British rule there. And this was going on during World War I. The Germans were all too happy to provide India with this because it helped them in their war effort. And this is typical of what you find during war times. And this was going on during the time of this mystery, as was the Mexican War. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on that affected California. And so what did that mean to our mystery? Well, because of the gun shipments going across the Southwest, they were brought in through the Gulf of Mexico. They were channeled through El Paso, put on trains, and brought through the American Southwest. And at the time, as now, at the time, San Bernadino's rail yard was already the biggest in the southwestern United States. It was a major railroad hub. So anything, freight, very much so freight, that went from anywhere from the east, down to San Diego or anywhere in Southern California, had to go through San Bernardino. That included these gun shipments that the Germans wanted to get into the hands of the Indian forces. Mm-hmm. So, when you are shipping armaments, you're a military intelligence officer and you've got something that important that you don't want anybody messing with, you're going to have your men in the field along the way making sure everything goes without a hitch. Yes. That means that there would have been some German agents here in San Bernardino where the weapons would have been switched from the train from Texas onto a train to San Diego. They definitely would have had agents watching those shipments to make sure they made it onto that next train. Now, if you're the recipient, you're also going to have your agents there to make sure you're not getting ripped off, to make sure everything's there. So, and if you have these German and Indian agents all over California, which you did because they were being arrested for sabotage and being caught, and it was big news back then, you're going to have British agents. So there we have in the mix British agents watching what the Indians and the Germans are doing, German and Indian agents, sabotaging the Brits and supplies to the Brits wherever they can, even here on the West Coast, and making sure these shipments go through, and it's all one big happy spy game going on. And if you got those three players, you got American agents watching what the Brits, Germans, and the Indians are doing. So it was kind of just a wonderland for the espionage world in California at that time. Mm-hmm. And now the side aspect of that was, and the book goes into this very much so, and anybody who knows their history of these guys knows where I'm going with this, is a lot of Germans in the espionage world were also some of the master occultists of their eras. Yes. And so here you have esoterically occult-minded men here. You have, as our geomorphology guy identified, you have a bunch of ley line, energy here. And then you've got East Indian agents. Now, their knowledge of esoterica goes way back, as we know. Yes. So you put that in the mix, and you're going to have guys who are very well educated and versed in the occult, and the mysteries and esoterica and such. And, of course, they're very much interested in spiritualism as well. So, you have all of these elements, throughout California and the U.S., but in this particular case, California, and you very much so have them here in San Bernardino at the time. Now, the East Indians is where the knowledge of the poisons come in, because as the book presents in much greater detail than I can here, there are poisons in India, various trees and plants and things that there is one in particular that the book describes that was known as the murder tree because people were caught murdering their husbands and wives by poisoning them with the poison of this tree because it was generally untraceable.
Oh, my goodness.
So here you have this untraceable poison known to India, very well known to their authorities, and here you have Indian agents here in the area, and you have somebody who clearly wanted to kill people with poison and have it be untraceable. You become a mathematician very quickly.
Yeah.
It's more smoke from the fire.
My goodness, your book is really fascinating, Walter. And gosh, and where can people get it?
Well, it is available only at Amazon.com as a Kindle book. Mm-hmm. And I want to remind everybody that Amazon gives the Kindle application away for free. You do not have to have a Kindle device to read a Kindle book. You can load the Kindle app for free at Amazon.com onto your laptop, your PC, your smartphone, whatever your device of preference is. You can load that for free so that you can enjoy Kindle books. And Empire of the Wheel is available there at Amazon as a Kindle book. And I'm presently researching, Rick and I are talking about, and I'm doing the groundwork on the research for the follow-up book, Empire of the Wheel 2.
Oh, well, you are certainly an expert